Mary Thompson had it all. A $500,000 insurance payout, a new life with her lover, and a corpse she thought would never speak again. But the dead don't always stay buried. And in the fall of 2022, her past didn't just haunt her, it moved in next door. Because the man watching her wasn't a stranger. He was Edward's revenge, and he knew every lie she'd ever told. Welcome to Vic's Crime Case File. We're dissecting one of the most brazen acts of betrayal I've ever covered. A story where guilt wears a friendly face, and justice comes knocking from the house next door. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where you're joining us from. Now, let's rewind to where it all began. Raleigh, North Carolina, 2018. On the surface, Mary and Edward Thompson were the picture of a happy couple. They lived in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, hosted barbecues for friends, and smiled in all the right places. But if you looked closer, you would have seen the cracks. The way Mary's laughter sounded just a little too sharp when Edward told a joke. The way Edward's shoulders tensed every time he checked their dwindling bank account. Money was tight, too tight. And Mary? She wasn't the kind of woman who settled for less. That's where Randy Lawson came in. He worked with Mary at the accounting firm. Charismatic, confident. The kind of man who always had a solution. While Edward was drowning in bills, Randy was whispering in Mary's ear about shortcuts. About how easy it would be to fix their problems. All it would take was one little lie. One small betrayal. And then another. And another. The affair started first. Secret lunches. Late nights at the office. Innocent touches that weren't so innocent. But soon, whispers turned into plans. Randy knew the system. He knew how to make numbers disappear. How to make evidence point where he wanted. And Mary? She knew Edward. Knew his passwords, his routines, the way he trusted her completely. So when money started vanishing from company accounts, when the auditors came knocking, it wasn't Randy's name on the documents. It was Edward's. The arrest was brutal. Edward's confusion turned to horror as the police dragged him away, his protests falling on deaf ears. Mary played the devastated wife perfectly. Tears, trembling hands, the whole performance. The jury believed her. The judge believed her. And just like that, Edward was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Branded a thief, a liar, a man who had thrown everything away. But the truth? He hadn't thrown anything away. Mary had taken it from him. And she thought she'd gotten away with it. Then the notes started appearing. At first, they were small. A slip of paper left in her mailbox. A message scrawled on the back of a receipt tucked under her windshield wiper. I see you. One read. You can't hide, said another. Mary told herself it was nothing, just some neighborhood kid playing a prank. But the handwriting was too precise, the words too deliberate. And when investigators later analyzed them, they found something chilling. The fingerprints on those notes? They matched a man who had no business being anywhere near Mary's life. A man who, by all accounts, should have been dead. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the notes, before the fear, there was a lie that started it all. And that lie, it was far from over. The morning they came for Edward started like any other. The coffee machine gurgled in the kitchen. The newspaper thumped against the front door. Mary stood at the mirror, adjusting her blouse, watching her husband through the reflection as he tied his shoes. Neither of them knew it would be the last ordinary morning they'd ever share. The knock came at 7:42 a.m., 3 sharp raps that would change everything. Edward opened the door to find 4 police officers waiting. Their expressions gave nothing away as they recited his rights. Mary's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes instantly welling with tears. She played her part beautifully, the shocked, devastated wife. But if you've been watching closely, you might have noticed how her fingers didn't quite tremble, how her sobs were just a second too late. The performance was flawless, but the timing was off. The trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors painted Edward as a greedy, calculating thief who'd stolen nearly $300,000 from his own company. They presented spreadsheets with altered numbers, falsified transaction records, even security footage of him entering the office after hours. Every piece of evidence fit together like a perfect puzzle. Too perfect, The jury never saw the way Randy Lawson shifted in his seat whenever Mary testified, never noticed how she carefully avoided looking at certain documents. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, Edward didn't scream or collapse. He just turned to Mary with this quiet, searching look, like he was seeing her for the first time. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. That small movement told the real story. 20 years. That's what they gave him. 20 years in Nash Correctional for a crime he didn't commit. Mary made sure to cry for the cameras outside the courthouse. She gave interviews about her heartbreak, her shock, her determination to stand by her man. The local news ate it up. Meanwhile, Randy was already planning their next move, because sending Edward away was only step one. The insurance policy they'd taken out on his life, that was step two. And the prison transfer they'd arranged, that was step three. But here's what Mary didn't know. Prison changes a man. It either breaks him or makes him dangerous. And Edward, he wasn't the breaking kind. Within weeks of arriving at Nash, he'd made connections. The kind of connections that could make evidence disappear. That could arrange meetings with certain law enforcement officials. That could fake a death so convincing even the coroner would sign off on it. The riot that killed Edward Thompson was beautifully orchestrated. Just enough chaos to be believable. Just enough witnesses to make it stick. When the call came informing Mary of her husband's death, she collapsed to her knees right there in the kitchen. Randy had to hold her up as she collected the insurance money. Had to support her as they packed up the house in Raleigh and moved to Wakefield Plantation. Had to comfort her through all those sleepless nights. Except Mary wasn't losing sleep over grief. She was waiting. Because 3 weeks after Edward's death, the first note appeared. Just a scrap of paper slipped under her new front door. "You look good in black," it said, "but red would suit you better." She told herself it was nothing. A prank. A coincidence. Then came the second note. And the third. Each one more specific than the last. The handwriting analysis would later confirm what Mary already suspected in her gut. Those notes? They weren't from some random stranger. The slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen, it all matched. Matched the love letters Edward used to write her when they were first dating. The one she'd kept in a shoebox at the back of her closet. The one she'd burned the day he was convicted. Mary started seeing him everywhere. In the grocery store. In the rear-view mirror. Standing under streetlights in the rain. She knew it couldn't really be Edward. She'd seen the death certificate. Had collected the insurance money. Had watched the news reports about the prison riot. But the notes kept coming. And the man who'd moved in next door? He had Edward's walk. Edward's mannerisms. Even Edward's damn laugh. What Mary couldn't figure out was how. How any of this was possible. She'd been so careful. Covered every track. Anticipated every outcome. Except one. She never considered that Edward might have friends on the outside. That someone might have been watching her this whole time. Waiting. Planning. Taking notes of their own. Because revenge isn't something you rush. It's something you savor. Like fine wine. Like a last meal. Like the look on someone's face when they realized the game was rigged from the start. The riot at Nash Correctional Institution erupted at precisely 9:17 p.m. on a humid August night. Guards would later report seeing Edward Thompson cornered near the west stairwell, outnumbered by 3 inmates with homemade shivs. The security footage, what little wasn't obscured by smoke and chaos, showed a brutal attack. A slash across the abdomen, a blow to the head, then the body being dragged into a cell where the fire started. By the time order was restored, the cell's contents had been reduced to ashes, along with the remains inside. The dental records matched. The death certificate was signed. Case closed. Mary received the news while eating takeout with Randy in their Raleigh apartment. The prison warden's voice crackled to the phone line, delivering the words she'd been waiting to hear for months. She made sure to drop her chopsticks, to let out a strangled cry, to collapse into Randy's arms with what appeared to be body-racking sobs. The performance was worthy of an Oscar. By the time the life insurance check cleared 6 weeks later, she'd already picked out new furniture for their Wakefield Plantation home. For 23 months, life was perfect. The The $500,000 bought them a 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch and enough square footage to avoid each other when necessary. Randy got promoted at the firm. Mary took up yoga. They hosted dinner parties where neighbors remarked what a lovely couple they made, how brave Mary was to rebuild after such tragedy. No one noticed how she always positioned herself facing the doors and windows, how she never sat with her back to an entrance, how she developed a habit of checking the locks 3 times before bed. Mary started noticing other things too. The way the new neighbor across the street, a quiet man who'd moved in around the same time the note started, always seemed to be outside when she checked the mail. How he wore his baseball cap pulled low. She tried convincing herself it was paranoia, that grief and guilt were playing tricks on her mind. Then one rainy Thursday evening, as she carried groceries inside, she caught him staring at her from his living room window. Not staring, watching, studying. And in that moment, she knew the body in the prison morgue hadn't been Edward's. The ashes they'd buried in the family plot weren't his remains. Somehow, someway, her husband was still alive, and he'd moved in across the street to watch her squirm. The insurance company would later discover the coroner had been bribed. The prison guards paid off. The dental records switched. But by then it was too late. The game was already in motion. And Mary? She was right where Edward wanted her. Trapped in a beautiful house with a man she couldn't trust, jumping at every shadow, analyzing every note, waiting for the day her past stopped sending messages, and came knocking on her door instead. The man who called himself Michael Harris moved into 4211, Willow Lane on the 1st of October, bringing nothing but a single suitcase and a black Labrador that never barked. Mary noticed him immediately. How could she not? The house had stood empty for months, and suddenly there he was, this quiet stranger with Edward's posture, Edward's way of tilting his head when he listened, even Edward's habit of rubbing his thumb along his fingertips when he was deep in thought. Coincidence, she told herself. Just coincidence. Until the notes started appearing in earnest. They came at first in innocent places, tucked between her morning newspaper, slipped under the doormat, left on her car seat when she forgot to lock the doors. The bed creaks the same way it did in our first apartment. Read one. You still take your coffee with 2 sugars, said another. Each message was typed on the same heavy bond paper, each one referencing some intimate detail only Edward could know. Mary began sleeping with a knife under her pillow. She installed security cameras that covered every angle of the property. She took different routes to work each day. None of it stopped the notes. By November, the psychological toll became unbearable. Mary would wake at 3 a.m. certain someone was in the house, only to find security feeds showing empty rooms. She started noticing Michael Harris standing at his window at odd hours, just watching her house, not in a threatening way, just observing, like a scientist studying an insect under glass. The more she tried to ignore him, the more his mannerisms screamed Edward. The way he tied his shoes, the brand of cigarettes he smoked, even the vintage watch he wore that looked exactly like the one she bought Edward for their 5th anniversary. Then came the rainy Tuesday that changed everything. The mailbox contained the usual bills and coupons, and one plain white envelope with no return address. Inside, Mary found a photograph, a recent one, taken through what looked like a prison visitation window. And there, staring back at her with cold, knowing eyes, was Edward, alive, unharmed. The date stamp in the corner showed it had been taken just 3 days earlier. Her hands shook so badly, she nearly dropped the picture. Because if Edward was alive, then whose remains had been buried in the family plot? What had she actually collected that $500,000 for? And most terrifying of all, what exactly had Michael Harris been doing in her neighborhood all these months? The photograph answered one question, but raised a dozen more. Because written on the back, in handwriting that matched the love letters Edward used to leave in her lunchbox, were 5 words. See you soon, sweetheart. That's when Mary realized the notes hadn't been warnings. They hadn't been threats. They were countdown markers. And whatever endgame Edward or Michael Harris had been planning, it was reaching its final stages. The security cameras hadn't stopped him. The locked doors hadn't deterred him. Because the truly frightening truth was dawning on Mary. She hadn't been watching for danger from the right direction all along. The real threat wasn't coming from outside her house. It had already gotten inside. The police came for Mary at dawn, just as they had come for Edward 3 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her as she stood barefoot in the kitchen, watching through the window as 3 cruisers pulled up with lights flashing, but no sirens. They knocked politely, almost apologetically, as if they regretted interrupting her morning coffee. Detective Morales held up the arrest warrant with one hand and a manila envelope with the other. Inside that envelope lay every secret Mary thought she'd buried: surveillance photos, bank records, even the coroner's signed confession about falsifying Edward's death certificate. Randy broke first. Faced with life in prison, he gave up everything within hours of being taken into custody. He told them about the embezzlement scheme, about planting evidence on Edward's computer, about the insurance fraud they planned before Edward even went to trial. Most damning of all, he described how they'd paid off 2 prison guards to fake Edward's death during that riot. What Randy didn't know, what none of them knew until that moment, was that Edward had outplayed them all. The guards had been working with Edward from the beginning, part of an elaborate sting operation orchestrated by an old friend from law school who'd become a federal prosecutor. The trial played out like a dark mirror of Edward's own courtroom drama 3 years prior. This time, it was Mary sitting at the defense table, her carefully styled hair slowly coming undone as the evidence piled up. This time, it was Randy's tearful testimony that sealed her fate. This time, the jury didn't deliberate for more than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts: conspiracy, insurance fraud, attempted murder. The judge called it one of the most cold-blooded schemes he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. When he handed down the 25-year sentence, Mary didn't react at all. She just stared straight ahead with empty eyes, already looking like a woman serving a life sentence. Edward walked out of prison to a hero's welcome. The media painted him as a wronged husband who'd orchestrated an impossible revenge. The same insurance company that had paid Mary her $500,000 now offered him a settlement to avoid bad publicity. He sold the rights to his story to a Hollywood studio and moved to the coast, where the salt air could finally wash away the stench of prison. As for Mary, she spends her days in a 6x9 cell at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, where the guards say she still jumps at unexpected noises, still checks her door multiple times before sleeping, still receives the occasional unsigned letter that she refuses to open. The other inmates whisper that she talks in her sleep, always the same phrase: "He's watching," and perhaps he is. Because in the end, Mary learned the hardest lesson of all. You can bury the truth, you can burn the evidence, you can even fake a man's death. But justice has a way of circling back when you least expect it. Sometimes in the form of police at your door, sometimes in a jury's verdict, and sometimes in the smiling stranger who moves in right across the street. And so we're left with that haunting question that lingers long after the prison door slams shut. How well do we really know the people in our lives? Mary Thompson thought she'd planned the perfect crime, the perfect betrayal, the perfect escape. She counted on money to protect her, on lies to shield her, on time to erase her sins. But in the end, all the planning in the world couldn't save her from one simple truth. The past always collects what it's owed. Now I want to hear from you. Look around your neighborhood right now. That quiet neighbor who keeps to themselves. The one who always seems to be outside when you check your mail. The new co-worker who knows a little too much about your habits. The stranger at the grocery store who gives you that odd feeling of recognition. What secrets might they be hiding? What stories are waiting to unravel? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me about the time you got that spine-tingling feeling that something wasn't quite right. I read every single comment, and your story might just inspire our next case file. Before you go, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because here at Vic's Crime Case Files, we're just getting started. There are more twisted tales waiting in the shadows, more shocking betrayals lurking behind closed doors, and more jaw-dropping moments when ordinary lives collide with extraordinary crimes. You won't want to miss what's coming next. And remember, the most dangerous criminals aren't always the ones behind bars. Sometimes they're the ones living right next door, smiling as they water their lawn, waiting patiently for their moment to strike. Sleep tight,